Prezentācija ir saistīta, protams, ar atvērtiem datiem, un tās autors ir no organizācijas, kas savā ziņā ir līdzīga LATai, bet runa ir par Eiropas atvērtā koda programmatūras uzņēmumu asociāciju. Stéfane Fermigier, I hope I pronounce your family name correct. I'm not so good in French.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. You can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. I hope you're ready with your presentation. We can start with it.
Yeah. So can you see the presentation also?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to present today two things, two important things related to open source policy in Europe. First, the organization that we founded a couple of years ago that I'm currently chairing, ATVÄRTA, and then our proposition about how to regain digital sovereignty in Europe using open source. So ATVÄRTA was founded two years ago, and it's not just another association, it's a federation of existing associations across Europe. And all these associations have in common the fact that they are they are representative, the open source industry in each European national country, at least those that are currently members. So we have currently 8 countries represented, France, Germany, Finland, Sweden, Portugal, the UK, Netherlands, and Italy. And hopefully other countries or other associations from other EU countries will join this year. We have another category of members which are associate members, like Open Forum Europe, which is not a national association, but which is very active in discussing digital policies and the open digital policies in Europe, and they are a natural associate member for ATVÄRTA. So a couple of slides about the current state of the open source market. First, a study that we did 3 years ago already, but the figures are currently the most recent we have regarding the global European market. It's not exactly all the EU countries, but it will give us quite a good view of what open source represents currently in Europe, and also the 3 currently leading economies in terms both of general economy, but also of IT industry and open source, which are France, Germany, and the UK, which was still a member of the EU when the study was conducted. So for France and Germany, and given that the growth of open source is still strong, with about 8 to 10% projected growth over the last couple of years, we can say with some assurance that the annual turnover for the open source industry is more than 6 billion euros for these 2 countries, and for the rest of Europe, it's probably more than 10 billion euros. So the overall turnover is probably largely more than 20 billion euros. It's probably a little bit less than 10% of the overall IT market. Another more recent study, which was published by the European Commission with a different focus. So they were really focused on the impact of open source on the European economy. And there were some interesting figures, including the fact that they tried, for instance, to measure the effort that's represented by all the contribution by the European countries to open source development, mostly in one well-known development open source collaborative website that everybody knows. So it's more than 1 billion just for the year 2018. So it's probably more these days. And this, according to the study, is contributing to enormous value to the European economy. What the model that has been developed by the economists that work on this study is that an increase of 10%, just an increase of 10% in terms of numbers of contribution would contribute to an additional 100 billion euros in GDP across Europe. So these different studies are very encouraging. It's clear that we must increase the contribution, the activity around open source in Europe, just for the sake of the economy and the growth of both the IT sector, but also the rest of the economy in the context of general digitization. If we compare the state of, let's say, the European countries that were studied during the study to, let's say, Asian country, we see that Europe is quite strong. At least some countries like France, Italy, Spain, less Germany, less Poland, are really strong in terms of public policies, when these public policies are target the public sector, but they are really less strong than, let's say, South Korea in this example, in terms of supporting the private sector. So what we must insist now is how to better support the private sector. But let's have a few words on digital sovereignty. For instance, last year, we polled the French entrepreneur, the French open source entrepreneur, on what they thought about digital sovereignty, and everyone, or almost everyone, answered that they thought that it was an important issue, but that the government, the European government, did not do enough to encourage this digital sovereignty, and especially to encourage free and open source software. In France, we have this definition that digital sovereignty must be defined as a strategic autonomy. It's not, the question is not to do everything ourselves. And when you think about open source, it's clear that open source is collaborative by nature. So it's the idea is not to have everything in Europe, but we still need to preserve an autonomous capacity for assessment, decision, in action. And the European Commission agrees that open source can have an impact on Europe's digital autonomy or digital sovereignty. And it can help the EU retain control. So there is already this perception that it is an important tool. In France, also, the Minister of Public Service thinks that it's important. And they even think that it's important that there is some kind of cooperation between the public sector and the private sector. And public procurement is one of the important tools for the government to encourage open source. The European Commission has created a couple of years ago an OSPO, an Open Source Program Office, which is an important organization object that will act as a catalyst for the growth of the adoption of open source in the public sector. In our opinion, it is an important step forward. But the document is really lacking any information or any decision regarding regarding really how to cooperate with the private sector. So I think we need to do more. We need to enforce the existing regulation. We need to finance development work and innovative work around open source, and we need to promote free and open source software, both in the public sector and in the private sector. So there is a plan in five slides. I will try to be short. The first slide is that this must be a real strategy. It cannot just be small decision there and there. There must be a coordinated strategy, both at the EU level and at the national levels. One of the tools should be the OSPOs, but the OSPOs shouldn't just be focused on internal needs of the public administration. They should also engage with the business ecosystems, and they also should have as a target to increase the purchase of open source services and software by the public administration they are working for. A second part of the plan is that public procurement should not just work with the big systems integrators that are doing open source, but that could be doing anything else. That should also be working with the companies and the organization that really create and maintain the free software that are used by the public administration, including many SMEs that are very active in Europe, but that are not as well known as the large American hyperscalers or large American vendors. Sorry. Another point is to promote investment in open source software, including in research and development, and it should make it easier for small companies to participate, because we know that some of the funding programs are more targeted to large companies. We could try to think about having tax incentives for open source contributions. There are already some mechanisms in France and in other countries for research and development, and there should be in this mechanism some provision for that more specific to open source. And more generally, public funding of open source projects should be increased. Education and training, this is really a big issue for all our companies across Europe to find engineers, software engineers that are well versed into open source technologies. And there is definitively, at least in France, there is definitively a lack of a real strategy at the education ministry level to boost computer science education and to include a large part of open source concepts and practices into the computer science education curricula. And the last point is to level the playing field. We know that there are many large companies that are really powerful. There are other countries that are very aggressive in terms of legislation and how they work with the other blocks. And we should not be passive. We should really increase awareness around free and open source software. We should ensure that there are adequate legal frameworks. For instance, software patents can be a real danger for open source software, and they should really be kept at bay. The GDPR, on the other hand, can be a very powerful tool, and we must keep the influence of the large companies at bay. So that was my presentation. These 5 points have been developed on an article, a Tribune that we published a few months ago, and that can be found on the Appel website. The Appel website is Appel, ATVL.info. I'm sorry I didn't put the website on the slides, but you can find it using your favorite search engine. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and for letting us hear also the more like pan-European sort of perspective. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.